Alright, good morning, my friends. Welcome back to episode 3 of Hidden Gems. So, even though this is only the third episode, at this point, some of you have probably caught on to the fact that I center what I listen to around the obscure repertoire, and not just with modern composers, where you don't really have a figurehead yet, where you don't have somebody who's in the forefront that you can consider the venerated master of a group. I think that I really like to go over composers that are considered contemporaries of another much more popular composer, even though the differences, in my opinion, are very clear. And this is the case of the composer today. And we're going to start off talking a bit about the composer who is much more popular, and that is Johannes Brahms. Johannes Brahms is, of course, the master of the conservative middle romantic people. There are so many of them, but Brahms was the figurehead in his own time, and of course he's one of the most popular composers ever today. But I don't really like him that much, even though a lot of the composers I do like are based around him. I don't like him because he's very austere. A lot of his music is much more serious, much less fun than I like to listen to. As you may have heard with Joseph Marx, even though the music definitely doesn't feel as if it's trying to have a lot of fun, as if it's dealing with playful topics, there are definitely moments where it feels like you can dance to it. And that's because I like kind of fun music like that. And that's the case of the composers I enjoy that are contemporaneous with Brahms. I think that if anything, they are closer to Mendelssohn. These are your Germanic, Jewish, playful melodic composers. They have nice harmonies, they have very skilled counterpoint, but the main draw of them is their melodic ability. I think that people like this can be Edward Franck, Ferdinand Hiller, Ignaz Brühl, Walter Rabel, Robert Kahn. But today we're going to focus on who might be considered the greatest of all of those, and that is Friedrich Gernsheim. What is there to say about Friedrich Gernsheim? He is immaculate. Today I'm mostly going to focus on his symphonies. As is the case with my listening habits, my favorite symphony cycles, not symphonies, but symphony cycles, are very odd choices. There are two main things I look for in symphony cycles. One is that each of the individual symphonies remain exciting throughout. Number two is that the symphonies be all different, at least to some degree, in character. I think that among the famous symphony cycles, or at least somewhat famous symphony cycles, a good example of this is Ralph Vaughan Williams. You can easily differentiate all 9 of his symphonies, and all of them are relatively exciting throughout. So what are my top 3 favorite symphony cycles? Number 1, maybe my favorite, would be Christian Sinding. Sinding, we might talk about his symphonies someday. He wrote 4 symphonies, all with a very strong Nordic passion to them. It's like Sibelius if he leaned even a little bit more into his Brucknerian side. Number 2 is Charles Tournemire. Tournemire was, of course, the organist who kind of bordered on Impressionism, almost aligned with the Mystic School, although he was definitely doing his own thing. He wrote 8 symphonies, and the last 3 of them are absolutely breathtaking works. And then number 3 is Friedrich Gernsheim. Probably my favorite of the Middle Romantic composers at all, and his symphony cycle is something to behold, let me tell you. And that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm probably going to keep this brief because one of my YouTubers who I'm looking up to for this entire series, David Hurwitz, he's already done a video about the Gernsheim symphonies. So I'm going to talk a bit about the symphonies, and I'm going to delve into what makes him not a somewhat unique composer, why was I going to say that? A truly unique composer. Much independent of Brahms, independent of Mendelssohn, independent of Schumann. He has his own unique voice, and we all need to spend more time exploring it. So we're going to start off talking about his Symphony No. 1 in G minor. This was his first symphony, written 2 years before Brahms' first. We all love to talk about how Brahms wrote his first symphony late into his career, but it is worth exploring how many symphonies that are compared to Brahms's were written before Brahms even wrote his first. Now, the first symphony is probably the least unique in style, especially the first movement. The first movement is an extended 15-minute traditional allegro, and it is a little bit cookie cutter, to be completely honest. Gernsheim was still developing his voice, and that's best displayed in the first movement of his first symphony. I mean, there are better first movements of first symphonies out there, to be completely honest, like Kaseya's first symphony, first movement. I'm going to need to talk about Kaseya's first someday. That is definitely on the docket. But, I mean, the first symphony does not start off as strong. The first and second movements are nice, but they aren't completely there. But then comes the third movement of that same symphony, and that is where his character really starts to show for the first time out of the four symphonies. And it's going to be delved into greater detail, of course, in his next three, but it's just so passionate, so happy, so energetic, and you just want to go skipping in a meadow once you hear the scherzo. You start off with a scherzo in your typical scherzo fashion. You know, if you're not familiar, the scherzo is going to traditionally be in ternary form. That means you're going to start off with your scherzo section, there's going to be a trio in the middle, and then part of the scherzo is going to repeat. Usually scherzos have a lot of repeat bars in there. The repetition of the scherzo the second time, the second A section if you will not have as many repeats, if any. Now, the Gernsheim scherzo is beautiful, and then the trio feels like something out of polka music. I love that scherzo. I actually sent it to one of my friends with whom I will be going to a concert next year because it's just such an attractive piece of music. And that's the thing about the Gernsheim symphony cycle. As opposed to even Mendelssohn, where as much as I do love Mendelssohn, his symphonies are a bit longer and maybe not as easy to listen to on the first listen. I don't think there's a single more accessible symphony cycle than Gernsheim's. The finale is also very strong as well. It shows off what is going to be called the Gernsheim happiness by me. It shows off the traditional, very happy energy that he demonstrates. There are lots of composers who are very energetic in their music, obviously, but Gernsheim is just so uniquely joyful, and I think that's part of what makes him so accessible. And this isn't just seen in his orchestral music. It's also seen in his chamber music, in his songs, in his piano music, in his choral works. Basically everything I've heard has demonstrated this to some degree, and I've heard most of his recorded oeuvre at this point. So it's definitely something that Gernsheim demonstrates in a vein unique from any of his famous contemporaries, and even independent of his lesser-known ones. The second symphony is the first that really displays Gernsheim's happiness in his music through its entirety, because it starts off with a very almost longing first movement, but not longing as in it is lamenting over something, but longing as if it is in love and wants to let that out to someone somewhere, but it has nobody with whom to converse, so he simply expresses his love through music. And that is shown in the first movement. And then the second movement is, I love the second movement. The second movement is not as much of a passionate love song. It's actually a tarantella, in which he uses, I think, triangle and tambourine. And it's very weird that he inserts it in the middle of a passionate, loving symphony, but it adds so much character to the work, because it's very quick, it's very quickly moving, that is to say, although it is only 3 or 4 minutes, and it has so much power in it. It almost feels like something that you'd play in sort of a bacchanalia thing. I think the percussion definitely adds some character to it. The third movement is the slow movement. Now, Gernsheim, I will admit that I'm not usually as big on romantic slow movements in truly any symphonies, but I think that Gernsheim may have actually broken that for me, because the third movement is relatively quick, and it's very thoughtful. It's not too slow, it goes quick enough that there is still some movement in there. And that's one of the problems, that a lot of slow movements don't have enough movement, no pun intended. And then, this is the only time it happens in the entire cycle, it's an attacca to the fourth movement. And that part I was whistling in the beginning of the video, that was the fourth movement of the second symphony. And the full melody is just, oh my gosh. Gernsheim was actually criticized in his own time because his melodies, and this is true, were considered to be too fleshed out for their own good. That is to say that it wasn't as easy to transform them motivically the same way a composer like Brahms might have done, where he used a lot of short snippets to build up his symphonies, and then he rearranged those in various ways. Instead, Gernsheim wrote longer, almost pop song-like melodies, and it all works. I mean, I'm not going to say that he did it wrong, and that's because he didn't. He pulled it off better than most composers probably could. I don't know another composer who did pull it off like he could, and that's definitely something for which he deserves credit, because the finale is absolutely marvelous. Next up is the Third Symphony. The Third Symphony is in G minor, and I imagine this must have driven his friend Brahms nuts. It is a programmed symphony, and I think this illustrates something that I haven't gotten the opportunity to rant about yet, but I want to rant about the War of the Romantics because it is completely blown out of proportion. Other than figures like Brahms and Clara Schumann on the conservative side, and Liszt and Wagner on the progressive side, maybe even Berlioz if you want to add him in, although I think he's more of a progenitor of the entire progressive movement. Other than those two camps of just like a couple people each, it's very intermingled, because Gernsheim, a composer who's close to Gernsheim in his sort of character is Raff, but Raff was a great friend of Liszt, while Gernsheim was a great friend of Brahms, and that's part of what illustrates the disparity. Now, I will say that out of the four symphonies, Gernsheim's third is probably my least favorite, but that is sort of like saying something is your least favorite late Beethoven sonata, or your least favorite late Mozart piano concerto. Like, it's such a high standard that calling something your least favorite, that still means that it's very, very high quality. So the Third Symphony is based on the Song of Miriam, and that is part of what explains its uniqueness, in that it is a very intimate feeling symphony. There is quite a bit more tension than you'll find in any of his other three symphonies. It's one of only two minor symphonies that he wrote, two major, two minor. The first was also minor. That symphony was in G minor. This one is in C minor. I think I may have said G minor when I first mentioned it, but it is in C minor. It has quite a few heart passages, but I think it's mostly characterized by how he writes for the winds. He uses a lot of oboe, most specifically, in this symphony, and it definitely helps bring out a lot of lament in this symphony, but it does still have your Gernsheim happiness, because he could not write a work that was not joyful, and that's just what I love about him. And that all leads into his fourth, final, and greatest symphony of all, the Symphony No. 4 in B-flat major. This is Gernsheim's most expanded orchestra. He includes more fleshed out woodwinds, and it's also probably the most confident sounding symphony. And this is something I think that really needs to be said, that in my opinion, the greatest display of a composer's ability is whether or not his music sounds confident. This is true of pretty much everything in music and art in general. This is true of performers, of conductors, of composers, of visual artists, of writers. Now, even if they write something that's even a little bit stupid, so long as it sounds confident, I will at least respect it. And respect, I think, is even more important than liking something, because respect at least acknowledges artistic potential. But Gernsheim, of course, is a wonderful artist, as I hope I've made clear at this point, and this sounds so confident. I mean, the whole symphony it's trademark Gernsheim. It has his kind of longer, very passionate melodies, It's in major and it stays that way throughout. It's very happy, it's almost jaunting. It jaunts because, it never really kind of drops dead. That's the thing about Gernsheim. He doesn't have dead spots in his music, even in his slow movements, where traditionally, as I said, there isn't a lot of movement. He finds a way to keep the symphony going, to keep it all flowing. And I mean, the first movement just starts off with this wonderful, kind of shorter violin melody that's played over spacious, extended chords, and then it goes into a short kind of triple meter or jump up to a short climax, and then that just kind of sets the whole tone. It's kind of setting a dichotomy of, on one hand, you have the extended, kind of passionate melody, and then you have the joyful, almost fanfare-esque nature of the counter to that. And that's Gernsheim for you. He's so happy, he's so confident, he's so accessible. If you are ever looking to recommend something to a new listener when it comes to symphonies, I would strongly recommend starting out with Gernsheim, because he is easily the most attractive symphonist that I have ever heard. I mean, of course, there are people like Brahms, there are people like Schumann, there are people, of course, like Mozart and Haydn, who are known for having their attractive symphonies. But Gernsheim is, at least among the romantics, probably the most confident and beautiful, because he can write attractive melodies, but he has the form and confidence to back it up. And that's why I think that Gernsheim may be the greatest romantic symphonist that you've never heard of. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll come back next time.